James had done had in 1660 established what he called the Royal African Company. And its charter, of which he was the principal stockholder, was to take English ships to go down the west coast of Africa to trade finished European goods to Africans for enslaved people. And you can even see on the corporate seal here, it's an African man and a woman and an elephant here. And this company lasted the better part of 90 years. And so these guys, who are patrons of the Duke of York, later to become James II in England, are responding to his request to buy and sell slaves into the new colonies over here in New England and then the Middle Atlantic, what became the Middle Atlantic states. So as always in the history of our country, you have to look at the economics because that is propelling a lot of what happened to the obvious detriment of the people who were enslaved. Now, not only this was happening, but you might recall too that in the Caribbean, where the English and the other European powers started to take over, in North Barbados was what has been recognized now as kind of the model for the colonial slavery patterns that came up to North America. And in this pretty famous image, these are, believe it or not, two Quaker people, English Quakers, and you can see the slaves in the background, because when the English took over Barbados in the early 17th century, they first started farming tobacco, which is this guy is holding. Many Quakers, by the 1640s, when George Fox established the religion, were businessmen and they were abolitionists at the beginning, came over and used slave labor to go from tobacco and then into the very, very lucrative sugar crop. And so there were huge plantations throughout Barbados, fueling not only slavery, but the riches of these people down there. And a lot of them, as it turned out, moved up to what was then East Jersey later on in the 17th century. And because of the history with not only the Dutch, but with what the Duke of York was encouraging, slavery began to get an even deeper hold in our state. And that has to do with a number of things, but one of which I'm sure you know as the Monmouth Patent, or sometimes the Navesink Patent, was actually written by Richard Nicolls, who was the governor who had come over and taken over from the Dutch. And that document gave to a number of people from Gravesend, they were English Baptists and some Quakers who were living up here in Gravesend, which is still extant in Brooklyn, that area of Brooklyn. He gave these 12 patentees, they were called, this huge piece of land, which was Monmouth County at the time. You now know it as Monmouth and Ocean County, in order to encourage settlement here. And so that patent territory conflicted with the proprietary land grant that Berkeley and Carteret had established. And it created, frankly, hundreds of years of property disputes in our state. But the commonality to both documents, both the proprietary claims and this Monmouth patent, was that slavery was encouraged. And it began soon after it had up in North Jersey, down here in where presumably most of us live. And here is part of that document. And you can see the 12 men here. We're going to focus and talk a little bit about James Grover, who was and is considered one of the founders of Middletown. So how did that all eventuate? Well, at a place called Tinton Falls. And it turns out that James Grover was doing a number of things in Middletown, but part of the land he owned was out in the Tinton Falls area, not called Tinton Falls at the time. And he started at what he called corn mills, but corn was the name for any kind of grain back in colonial time. And he realized too that there was an opportunity to take what's called bog iron out of the decaying vegetation and create an iron mill. And he started to do that. And he quickly ran out of resources. He was in way over his head, he and two partners. And so he was there for a very good reason, by the way, and obviously a much later picture. But that Tinton Falls at one point had a natural waterfall of about 20 foot high. The largest waterfall in New Jersey, south of the Great Falls up in Patterson. And as you know, in colonial times, you needed a power source to run mills and anything else virtually. And that was, of course, water. And that's why Grover and other of these early founders are always settling on where they can find running water. In any event, he didn't have enough money and he didn't have enough resources. And through a series of mortgages with some people, eventually a Quaker sugar plantation owner named Lewis Morris comes up from Barbados with 60 or 70 of his slaves to what he calls Tinton Manor, including a guy we know a lot about, an African. He called him his personal servant, but he was actually a slave named Geffen. And he comes up here, and we have this contemporary 1676 sketch that was done of his manor. You can see here, Tinton Manor of Lewis Morris. He called himself Colonel Lewis Morris. Right where Tinton Falls, that little village is today. We'll show you a picture of that in a second. And right there, where this little flag is right here. So for orientation, those of you who live down here, this is Sycamore Avenue, right? This is Tinton Falls Avenue. Here is MJ's, you know that? And across the street used to be Charlie Brown's, I forget what it's called now. Oh, Woody's. And right here on this property, about there, is what archaeologists believe is a slave burial ground. Because when Lewis Morris takes over with these slaves, they're of course going to do all the hard labor for his farming and his iron milling. And as they would perish, they were buried, people believe, right about there. And there's a sign there that the Tinton Falls Historic Society has put up to honor those folks who are probably buried there. And probably in other places on this huge plantation, which is what the English called everything in those days, of originally 3,400 acres, eventually 6,400 acres, a huge part of Monmouth County land up in this part of the world. And one of those archaeologists is my friend here, Dr. Rich Veit, you might know from Monmouth University. And this is a current picture that took a few months ago when we were all there looking at some of the grounds on what had been Lewis Morris iron mine. There's some talk about doing some archaeology there over and beyond what's been done. But suffice it to say that this is where historic slavery in basically central New Jersey, but certainly Monmouth County, began very early toward the end of the 17th century. So you've got it up north, established by the Dutch, and then the English in Bergen County, and then down here in Monmouth County. And it takes off everywhere very, very quickly, as you'll see here. So what's going on here at the ironworks? So now, this is a map oriented again, not my fault, with north at the bottom. And it's a tracing of an actual contemporary map of the Lewis Morris property. He owned all of this property here. This is this coming from the left here. This is the Navesink Swimming River branch and down into Pine Brook. You can see here, frankly, this is Sycamore Avenue today. And right here is the Tinton Falls that we talked about. And on this map, one of the designations, lettered F capital here, but lower F case here, is what's called on this early map, the Negro. I thought it meant feller, but it really is the way the English wrote S's, you know, it's the English cellar, or the Negro cellar. And what does that mean? Well, as luck would have it, we have actually handwritten, preserved documents at the Monmouth County Historic Association that Lewis Morris, we believe, wrote back in 1676, all his expenses at his Tinton Iron Works. And again, what he's doing is, that was started by Grover and his associates, he's taking this deteriorating vegetation, marl, and other things, And from that, he's able to get iron, which is very, very important to colonial times. And he brought down, those of you who live locally know Leonardville, okay, Leonardville Road. He brought down a father and son group from Massachusetts who were ironmongers, the Leonards. And they created here at this property an early iron furnace, feed all this stuff in here through a whole series of processes. You can extract pig iron, which is like gold in colonial days. And on one of those very early records, you can see James Grover's name because he continued to work at the iron mill. Right here, this says the Negro House and Carpenter Shop. So what we think that means is that here in the Negro cellar, these slaves, and they rarely use the word slaves in these old documents, are living beneath the carpenter shop in very, very, what would have been very, very primitive conditions, of course. And they're doing all the heavy lifting and all the heavy farming work, such as this. Okay, anything that white people could get enslaved people to do, they're doing. And again, this begins the practice throughout New Jersey. And by the way, this is happening in all the colonies up through what is Maine today, but was then part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. All of the original 13 colonies have deep roots in enslavement, which was an outgrowth of what the English and the Dutch had done very, very early on. So Lewis Morris is there 15 years or so, and he's getting old and sick, and he writes his last will. It's a huge document that I've read, and in it, there's a couple of notable things. One is that because he's still a Quaker, believe it or not, he leaves to the Quaker meeting in Shrewsbury, not the one that's there today, but the predecessor. What he says is £5 current money every year for ever after, to be paid out of the Tin and Iron Works. Now, I know the remaining dozen or so Quakers there, and they have never seen any of that money to their chagrin, but there it is. But more startling to me when I came across this is the following item in his will, which says, I give and bequeath unto my honored friend, William Penn, my Negro man, Yath, provided said Penn shall come to dwell in America. And you have to go, what? William Penn? This guy? Okay, the kind Quaker who established Pennsylvania and was, benevolent toward the Indians and all this. And the truth is, yes. And there's a backstory here, of course, as there always is. And before we get to that backstory, I want to show you the really horrible part of Lewis Morris's will. And he's got 14 or more pages of inventory. When you would die in early colonial America, men would come in after your death, take a very, very detailed inventory of your property and your goods, and make sure your debts are paid off, and then your bequeaths would go to whomever. And down here, after his carts and his ships and all these things that he owns at his plantation, we find this designation, these Negroes, okay? And Lewis Morris, at his death in 1691, has 66 enslaved people, worth, as you can see, 844 colonial pounds. And if you iterate one of these men who would have been Yath and do the math, he'd be worth over $55,000 today. Moreover, these people, and you can see them how they're ranked. The men are worth more because they do heavy labor, the women a little bit less, the boys, girls, children, and so on. Just the people alone that Lewis Morris owned would have been worth that amount of money, which is, 20% of his entire wealth. So he's obviously a multimillionaire in today's dollars and one of the richest men in what was then East Jersey. And not only that, where his influence goes even further is that those enslaved people represented almost 60% of the then enslaved population in all of East Jersey. He's influential in any number of ways, but this way in particular that has to do with our story. Okay? Because as other people who begin to colonize early New Jersey see that, the richest people are building their wealth on the backs of enslaved people, they do what all people do. They want to imitate that, and if they can, they begin to acquire enslaved people for their own goods. Here's the backstory on William Penn. As you know, he came in and founded, this again north of here, he came in and founded Pennsylvania and Philadelphia in the early 1680s. And then because he's a businessman, he goes back to London. And he has his colonial secretary take care of his properties, and he's trying to collect rent, and he's not very successful at it. But while Penn's away, he does a couple of interesting things. He has his secretary build a kind of a country estate up here, and he called it, immodestly, Pennsbury. And we know that slaves that Penn owned helped build this. And you can go to Pennsbury Manor today if you want. It's been recreated, and they do a fairly good job of talking about the enslaved people that had been there. But in any event, Penn's back in London for a while, and then he does return to America in 1699. Certainly not to just take over this bequeathment from Lewis Morris, this man Yaff, but to look after his colonial affairs, which are not going too well. But he does get this man Yaff from Lewis Morris's nephew, same name, Lewis Morris, who had inherited the property. And some really, really interesting things happened, but suffice it to say that in 1703, Penn goes back to London yet again, and he takes Yaff with him. Now, how do we know that? Well, we know that because he sends a letter back to James Logan, his secretary, dated from London in 1703. And in that letter, he says, I have resolved after 4 years' faithful service that Yaff will be free. And I will also pay for his safe passage if he wants to go back to America. Pretty startling that we have this document about one man who started his life probably in Africa, but at least by the 1640s is in Barbados with Lewis Morris, gets turned over after his death to William Penn, and now is in England. Furthermore, Penn writes that Yaff is an able planner and he's a good husbandman. He obviously works with animals and promises fair. Now, before the pandemic, I had booked a ticket. I'm going to go over to England, stay with some friends, and see if I could find any trace of this man Yaff. I don't think, and this is just speculation at this point, I don't think he had come back to America where he had been enslaved unless, and we have no records of this, unless he left behind a family, a wife, perhaps some children, but there's no records to that. And because of his expertise, and obviously he spoke language, English language, he spoke probably several other languages, knew all these famous people, and was a pretty accomplished guy who we think is probably in his mid to late 50s by the time he gets over to England. I think he would have stayed there and continued life, to be determined. But the fascinating part here is what Penn writes is that he left him in Deal. Now that's Deal on the coast of England that some of you may have visited to. It's where the Thames comes in and goes and continues up to London. And in fact, our Deal in Monmouth County is named after that. So I had hoped to go down there and see if there's any trace of Yaff. And if I do, I'll let you know someday. We don't know. We frankly don't know what became of him. But we do have a number of mentions of this man, which is very, very unusual for slave to be mentioned by name. And because of his association with these famous men, just by the luck of that, we have a number of documents about it. So, as I mentioned, these early starts of slavery are such that it takes off. Now, here's a very early, probably the first census of New Jersey taken in 1737. And on this side, these columns are all white people we don't even have 21 counties back then, right? In these counties, there's about 44,000 white people in New Jersey. And over here, Negroes and other slaves, and they, of course, would be Lenape Indians who still remain, some, not all, but some of those were enslaved. There's about 4,000, according to this. And what's worse for us is that although the total enslaved population is about 8%, in Monmouth County, because largely of what Lewis Morris had started, we have almost 11% of our population is enslaved, only exceeded by Bergen by percentage, by Bergen and Somerset County. Bergen, of course, where the Dutch had started slavery in the beginning of time, and Somerset, which was being pushed out as these lands were developed as well. So again, you can see the importance of enslavement to all of New Jersey, frankly. And although that may look good from the perspective of white slaveholders now, it also scared the bejesus out of them because they were well aware of slave rebellions and slaves running away, which was happening all the time. In the Caribbean, forever, slaves were rebelling and running away. And a lot of these early colonists were still in touch with the Caribbean. They had business interests there, certainly the rich people like Morris and others. And famously in Jamaica, there were several slave rebellions. There were several in Barbados. The most famous, of course, is in Haiti, but that's a little bit later in the 18th century. And in the early part of the 18th century, there had been a slave rebellion in New York, which was very close, New York City then. In fact, 4 years after this survey was taken, there was a huge outbreak in New York City where slaves were accused of a conspiracy, burning down houses in lower Manhattan, and they were brutally treated when they were captured. They were hanged, beheaded, and all kinds of behavior as punishment to these folks. And so as this population is growing, both by the importation of slaves and also natural generation, including by white slaveholders that we all know about, the risk to the white slaveholder increases. And so what do? They increasingly create more and more harsh laws in New Jersey and elsewhere to control the slave population. And a lot of what happened then is influential, as I'm sure you recognize, to where we are as a society today. Okay? So, this is Lewis Morris, the nephew, who plays another big role in enslavement in New Jersey. He inherits the property from his uncle in 1691. He's raised a Quaker and enhances the property to about 6,400 acres. Clearly the wealthiest in Monmouth County, and also the largest slaveholder. And he does something really, really interesting. Even though he was raised a Quaker, though we don't think very devoutly, he gets visited by George Fox, who founded the Quakers. He was a family friend, frankly. And Fox comes over to Shrewsbury on one of his early 18th century visits, and he sits down with Lewis Morris in Tinton Manor and basically says, "Hey, Lou, I'm a little concerned here about the way you're treating these enslaved people." Now, the Quakers are pretty adamant today when they talk to me about this. George Fox was not an abolitionist, but he was, if I can borrow your phrase, a humanist to the extent that he wanted slaveholders to treat these enslaved people more humanely. And he has discussions over a couple of days with Lewis Morris, who basically can't figure out a way to, free his slaves. I don't think he ever wanted to, because that's the basis of his wealth. And we also know that he, as his children get married, he bequeaths his enslaved people to them. And so what he does is he decides to leave the Society of Friends and starts religious services with another ex-Quaker on Tinton Manor property, and is considered today one of the founders of Christ Episcopal Church which you may know at the Four Corners in Shrewsbury. In fact, if you go in there today, you'll see this plaque that Lewis Morris, this guy here, and William Leeds, another man who Leedsville, we now call Lincroft, was named after. And this guy, George Keith, who started out as a Quaker and also bolted to become what then was Church of England. These are considered the founding members of Christ Church. And they're all slaveholders. This Lewis Morris is a politician, not a very nice man from all the reports, pretty brutal in the way he treats everybody. But he does rise through the ranks to become the first colonial royal governor of New Jersey in 1738. And then does what these people would do in those days. He relocates his government, his initial government, over to a place called Trenchtown in Western Jersey. And here it is along the Delaware River. And he rents this house from a man who owned it then, who was a guy named Governor Thomas of Pennsylvania. That house had been erected by William Trent, another Philadelphia Quaker and a friend of William Penn's. Now, Trent is dead at this point, but we have a remarkable letter from Lewis Morris here over to Governor Thomas saying, I want to rent that house we talked about. This is after he gets over there, or I should say right before he gets over there. And in that letter, he says, do me a favor, can you spend some money? I'd like you to put a building out, an outbuilding, as a kitchen and to lodge my servants. And what Lewis Morris is writing about here is he's going to come over, rent this house, and in colonial time, you would build an outbuilding like a kitchen if you were rich enough, because of the fear of fire, you wouldn't have a kitchen in your home. And also because his wife, Isabella, does not want to bring slaves into their home that she lives with in Tinton Manor. They have a relatively big house in Tinton Manor. Slaves have their own domicile, and when she comes over to Trenton, she's not about to have them live in this little house. And so that's what happens. An outbuilding, a kitchen to house the slaves that he brings over there. You can visit that house, maybe some of you have today. That's the identical house right here. It's called the Trent House Museum. I've been there and spoken there. And that outbuilding is here. It's long gone. And a few years ago, Rich Veit, who I talked about, went over and conducted, and it's an ongoing investigation to look for what may be, and I don't know it yet, the remnants, the foundation of that kitchen and slave quarters. And if they can determine if it was at one point, that they might find all kinds of cultural artifacts that enslaved people would leave behind that would tell us a lot about these people. So I guess my point here is that, as you've seen, Bergen County, Monmouth County, and now over to what became Mercer County, slavery is proliferating throughout, mostly propelled by these rich and well-connected men. So Tinton Manor's influence goes above and beyond, as I've mentioned. And I'm skipping through a lot of history quickly, of course. But by 1771, we've got a series of documents. This one was for Shrewsbury Township. And Shrewsbury Township in those days went from basically Red Bank south all the way down to Little Egg Harbor, as you might have seen in that map. And this document for just Shrewsbury, and there's one for Middletown, and there's one for, it's called Dover, but it's Tom's River, and one for Stafford, is really a tax list. And these are men, almost all men, who owned enslaved people. And that document reads the following, as you can see. And apparently this Asher West, who was a constable, went around Shrewsbury and tried to account for all the enslaved people. And as you'll notice, these people have only a couple of slaves each. These are basically yeoman farmers, small landholders who can afford only a few. You can see here 3, this guy, John Corliss, who we're going to talk about, has 4. And so slavery that begins with large landholders who are very wealthy, of course, starts to seep its way through in the intervening early part of the 18th century to anybody who can afford an enslaved person. Now, these four people are really, really interesting. We won't talk a lot about them. I do some coverage of it in the book about them. But they are prominent in early Shrewsbury history. And men like John Corliss, he's one of only a few Quakers. Now, Quakers from West Jersey are coming over to preach in the late, around this time frame actually, the 1750s and beyond, because now they're embracing abolition as a cause. And it's creating a lot of consternation for me among the Quakers on this list, of course, because they don't want to give up their slaves. And so it becomes very, very complicated as professed Quakers who believe in all the precepts of the Society of Friends are challenged to treat their enslaved people better, to teach them to read and write, and eventually to manumit them. But they don't all do it. Now, these four men play a crucial role in what I call now the four corners of slavery. You know this as Route 35 and Sycamore Avenue. And this is an imagined painting. That's the Allen House today. This is the first, not the one that's there now, the first Christ Church. Here's the Quaker Meeting House in the other corner. And back here, this is actually a blacksmith shop, but this was owned by this guy up here, John Wardell. His home is still there on the property of the Shrewsbury Mystery Center. But the reason I call it that was every one of these corners in what was then the start of Shrewsbury Town, and these four men in particular, are slaveholders, as were so many of these others, as you can see. Samuel Cook here, believe it or not, was the pastor of Christ Church. In fact, he helped build the current building much later on, but he was a slaveholder, his Church of England. Josiah Halstead here owned the Blue Ball Tavern, you and I call it the Allen House today. He had many, many slaves. In fact, he had more than the two here. And as would be no surprise to you this time of year in tax season, not everybody was honest when they talked to people collecting information about their taxes. John Wardell and his entire family were slaveholders. He had a number of slaves on his property. Corliss, by the way, lived in Shrewsbury, but as it turns out, I found he lived down in what is now Rumson, in that peninsula, way down at the end of the peninsula, kind of behind where Holy Cross Church and School are now. But he owned enslaved people down there, and he was a Quaker. So what happened? So that's 1771, right before, as you know, the Revolutionary War. And I'll bet everybody here has seen this picture from the time they were in kindergarten. It's actually a painting that was done 75 years after the fact. And it's this very iconic and, hypothetical picture, apocryphal, if you will, of George Washington and these men crossing the Delaware at McConkey's Ferry over here from Pennsylvania. They're coming over to New Jersey, and it's Christmas Eve, 1776, and they're going to go down south here when they land and surprise the British at Trenton, that the old barracks is called now. And what are they doing? Well, of course, it never happened like this, but as we were all taught, they were fighting for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But the question we're asking this morning is, that's terrific, but whose? And the answer is mostly landed gentlemen like themselves. Washington's a Virginian, of course. He owns slaves, many, many slaves, as do a lot of these, not all, but a lot of these folks. And they are rebelling against what the English are doing. Among those things is the threat of them losing their enslaved people. We're going to talk about how that plays out. But what I had never noticed in my lifetime until recently, and maybe you hadn't, was right in front of George Washington there is a black man. Now, I don't think the artist, although again, this is a hypothetical picture, I don't think he was making that up. I think he knew something. And what he probably knew was that George Washington did in fact have a slave accompanying him throughout the war. And here's another image of that man whose name was Billy Lee. And here's a French sketch, actually, of George Washington. And Billy Lee had been, to our surprise, the personal slave of George Washington who had purchased him before the war for what was then 61 colonial pounds. And to give you an idea what that meant, and again, Washington's a fairly well-to-do guy, around that time, you could have bought 8 horses for that amount of money, or these other quantities of goods. Or if you were I don't know, a shipwright maybe, or a blacksmith, it'd take you the better part of 2 years to earn 61 pounds. But George Washington buys this Billy Lee, who accompanies him throughout the Revolutionary War, most of whose battles were fought, as you know, in New Jersey. Okay? And what's ironic about this image is, while it accurately depicts Billy Lee, you know, helping probably putting George's horse to rest for the night. And by the way, these tents, these battle tents that he would erect for George Washington every time he moved, they're still extant. There's one in the Smithsonian. Billy Lee did all these kinds of things, served his meals, took messages back and forth. And the irony of this image is that, as the French were so grateful to acknowledge, is George Washington's holding the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. Well, not so much for Billy Lee. Billy Lee, as I mentioned, stayed with Washington throughout the war. And in fact, in one of the sad episodes in their relationship, at the end of the war, Lee had met a woman, and he went to George Washington, and they were about to retire down in Mount Vernon, and he asked George Washington if he could bring his betrothed, Margaret Thomas, another black former slave, to Mount Vernon. And Washington hesitated. He said, I'll have to think it over. So you can imagine, this guy's been with him for, you know, the better part of 13, 15 years. And the most human of gestures to allow this faithful man to bring a wife, Washington was not sure that he could do that. You probably do know, topic for another time, that the Washingtons had, at George's death in 1799, over 300 enslaved people down in Mount Vernon, one of whom is Billy Lee, who was the only enslaved man that at his death, Washington freed through his will. So again, not uncommon for the way people thought back in those days. They established very close relationships with enslaved people, and yet thought of them as just kind of one step below common humanity, if you will. We've got a number of drawings and images. Here's another one of Billy Lee, always in the background, as you see. That's Martha, her 2 grandchildren through another, her first marriage. Her first husband had died. And these are children that George Washington adopted. And there's a lot of stories about them as they became slaveholders in their own right. But want to try to bring a little bit more local information to us today. So you remember our friend John Corliss? I'll spell it a little differently here. Right before the revolution, he takes out an ad in the newspapers advertising for the return of, he called a Negro man, his slave, Titus, who he says, oh, he may probably change his name. And he goes on to describe this guy. He's about 21 years of age, not very black, almost 6 foot tall. And he talks about what he's wearing. And this is because when enslaved people would run away in those days, they frequently ran away with just literally the clothes on their back to New York, which is where Corliss takes his ad out. He thinks he's probably up there, and he's hoping somebody will recognize him, and he's going to give him £3, which is a lot of money if they return him. Now, what we know happens is that Titus responds to something that's going on. And what's going on at the beginning of the Revolutionary War, soon to start, is that the British, the English, believe that it's a little rebellion they're going to be able to put down real quickly. And what they do is, in the guise of this guy, Lord Dunmore, named John Murray, right there, he issues a proclamation that says, hey, look, any of you runaway slaves who want to come and fight for us and put down this little rebellion of your former slaveholders, we're going to free you at the end of the revolution. He didn't call it a revolution, he called it a rebellion. And that's very attractive, obviously. And thousands of enslaved Black men and women run away during what becomes the Revolutionary War. And it creates great, great problems for the slaveholders that you can imagine. And we have actual remnants of some of the clothing. And a lot of these runaways wore outfits that said liberty to slaves, because they were convinced if they fought on the other side, they were going to be freed. It didn't work out too well for the English or the enslaved runaways. But Titus, we know, runs away and joins what Dunmore, Lord Dunmore, called the Ethiopian Regiment, made up of Black runaways. And he comes back, and he's living in what was then an island, Sandy Hook, okay, and he participates in the Battle of Monmouth, of all things, where he earns quite a reputation. They were, by the way, Black fighters, enslaved, and men that were seeking their slavery on both sides of that battle over in, as you know, Freehold. He is rechristened Colonel Ty. He winds up commanding way up here. You can see this early map in Sandy Hook. When I said it's an island, periodically the sea would break through. Some days, some months it was an island, sometimes it was a peninsula. And Refugee Town, where the Black Brigade was headquartered during the Revolutionary War, was right at the foot of this oldest lighthouse still working in America, the Sandy Hook Lighthouse. And Titus knows this area very well, because as I mentioned before, he was enslaved by John Corliss way down here at the Rumson Peninsula. And he had traveled during his enslaved days throughout this area and knew it quite well. And so the English recognized that, and they kind of deputized him. He's leading guerrilla raids all over Monmouth County, and he becomes this infamous terrorist. In fact, one of the early raids that he's part of is at Tinton Falls, ironically enough. And one of the quotes we have from one of the local folks whose houses were burned is that the Loyalist raiders, who they were terrified of, I mean, you can imagine these Black men who were formerly enslaved suddenly show up in the dead of night and start burning and pillaging, taking cattle and capturing people, et cetera, et cetera. And so Titus, now Colonel Ty, does this for months and months. In fact, in one of the most famous of his escapades, right there in Tinton, what is now Colstack, actually, he besieges what was, as you probably recognize his name, Joshua Huddy's home. Huddy was, famous in his own right, thorn in the side of the British. When they finally located where he lived, Titus goes over. They surround the house for a couple of days, and during that battle, Colonel Ty gets shot in the wrist, and because there's no medication in those days, he dies of typhus a couple of days later. And in my estimation, it's probably the most famous runaway escape slave working on the British side during the entirety of the Revolution. Story for another time. Joshua Huddy's subsequent hanging, becomes a big, after the war, bone of contention between the British and what became the Americans. Story again for another time. So I'm going to try to bring it down to the 19th century now, or up to the 19th century, I suppose, by talking about an individual enslaved family, because up till now we've been kind of focused on mostly white slaveholders. And I was privileged to find out a lot about this family. And the Reeves family, who grew up in what was then Leedsville, was founded, this particular branch, by this man who was born enslaved in Middletown, on the property of David Williamson, and that house you'll see in a minute, on Newman Springs Road. And later on in his life, he falls in love and marries this woman, Hannah Van Cleef, who was born enslaved, possibly at the Taylor Butler House in Middletown on Kings Highway. When I say possibly, there is a woman named Elizabeth Van Cleef that was a slave there who may be related, but it's very, very hard to trace a lot of these folks. But what's interesting about their names, you'll notice that Reeves may be an English name, so maybe Charles Reeves had once been enslaved or one of his ancestors by English folks. And Van Cleef is obviously a Dutch name. Many of the Dutch in Monmouth County in particular were slaveholders. And as I mentioned, those two homes still exist. This house, until very recently, is up now in Homedale, but was then in Middletown. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I hope nobody here owns it, but they just painted it white again. And this is the current Taylor Butler House owned by the Monmouth County Historic Association. There's a wonderful exhibit there in an adjoining house called Moth Pit Hall, called Beneath the Floorboards, showing artifacts of the enslaved folks that were part of the Taylor family. But to get back to the Reeves, here's an old map with Red Bank on the right, of course. Here's Swimming River. Here's Leedsville, which is Wincroft today. And here's the Williamson House right here. This is Newland Springs Road, where Charles Reeves was born enslaved around 1823. And in those days, as will become obvious in a minute, when he was manumitted, he went to work for George W. Crawford. You might recognize Crawford's Corners Road, and you can see even on this map, there are many Crawfords, including George and John, and a whole lot of Crawfords in that part of our geography. So once Charles becomes manumitted, he goes to work for George Crawford, and he lives in that house. And there's a really fascinating story about that house, which was located on Middletown Lincroft Road. It's no longer there. Here is what was called Five Corners. Remember the old Lincroft Inn right there? We live right up the road from that. And the story about that has to do with this. Among the early laws of New Jersey, as we worked our way slowly toward abolition of slavery, was this act passed in 1804. And it's called the Gradual Act because what it says in it is that any children born to enslaved women after July 4th are free, with a big gotcha. If they're female children, they have to serve for 21 more years for that master. And if they're male children, 25 more years. Additionally, the slave holders have to register slave births at the county courthouse. And we have all of those records still at Monmouth County. They're online, actually, at the county clerk's website if you want to see them. Now, what's crucial about that is we know that soon after Charles and Hannah were in and around the time that they were manumitted by law, they get married. And we have their actual marriage certificate right here. It says Homedale because they were married. Some of you who live in Homedale or have lived in Homedale or driven through might even recognize the Baptist Church. It's not a Baptist church anymore. I think it's UUMC. But in any event, that's where they got married, as did other Black formerly enslaved people in 1850. So right around the time they're free, they become a couple. And here's where the story gets even more interesting, to me at least. Reeves is working for George Crawford, and he enters into an agreement which is a lot like tenant farming, but it's called cottaging up north. And what happens is George Crawford says that in return for working for me, I'm going to give you, Charles, and your wife a home. And we know that around 1863, when Charles Reeves goes to work for him, that home you saw is rolled over on logs to where it eventually resides on the Lincroft Road. And it turns out that he and his wife and the 11 children they raised there stayed in that home without ever owning it for the next 37 years of his life. And here's a picture around the turn of the century of that original home you can see here. And that is Hannah Reeves, Hannah Van Cleef. This is probably an addition. And we know that they own that home and raised their family there in this very rudimentary condition. They had dirt floors. I'll tell you how I know that in a minute. And it wasn't until 1900 when George's son, James Crawford, finally gives James Reeves, who's the son of Charles and Hannah, this property. So can you imagine they had to work on a half an acre, not even a half an acre of property and a home for 37 years before they earned it. And here's a picture of James Reed, their son, who gets this deed. And it's interesting, this deed is only written to him 2 months before his father dies. So we think he's on his deathbed. And for some reason, George Crawford's dead, and James now feels that he should honor that agreement and give the property to the Reeves family. And here are pictures from their relatives of some of the other children of the Reeves, and they all are born free, and they become very prominent citizens in their own right, both here in Monmouth County and other places. 4 generations of people were raised in this house under very austere conditions. The house lasted until the 1970s. When I was living in Middletown, I must have passed it 100 times and never thought about it because it had been dilapidated. And just an amazing testament, I think, testimony to people who were born under incredible circumstances to rise above that and prosper. And they did. And one of their family members gave me a newspaper clipping, which was a story by a woman who's riding in a reporter in a horse and wagon around the early part of the 20th century. And she talks about here a Negro's cabin. And she says here, and by the doorway to the sunshine, a broad-faced old turbaned mammy sat serenely knitting marigolds, blah, 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 in the very idyllic kind of language. But she's talking about Hannah Van Reeves, and Cleef Reeves. And this came to me from one of their family members. So it's just an incredible thing that we have these early documents to formerly enslaved people who did quite well over time. And as I mentioned, the next 4 generations did extremely well and established themselves throughout not only Monmouth County, but in their lives. And I'll tell you about that. But first we have to kind of segue into another little story here. So in 1850, another Crawford, John B., a relative of George, sells to these 14 free black men that property for about $60, which is a lot of money. And we have a map of that property. And that property was sold to these men, okay, who are going to establish a burial ground. And that's called, some of you may have read about this recently, the Cedar View Cemetery. It's right behind St. Leo the Great Church in Linkwell. I'm part of the board of trustees who are restoring this historic property. It's one of the earliest black burial grounds in Monmouth County. It's got the graves of formerly enslaved people, as well as soldiers, what were called United States colored troops during the Civil War. And these 14 men buy this property, and 20 years later, right here, right there, Charles Reed buys this piece of property. This is about a 38-foot by 99-foot plot, as are all the other 24, from Alexander Frost, who seems to be like the leader of this group. And Charles Reed and his family have more extant gravestones in their plot than any other family did. In fact, that's Charles and Hannah's stones are there. And so we know a lot about their family. When I say 13 family interments, those are the stones that remain. There are, we know by record, many, many more of their relatives, as is common in any graveyard, buried underneath and in the same plots as their forebears. How do I know all these things? Because I got really lucky. Toward the end of her life, I met this wonderful woman, May Edwards, who happened to be the great-granddaughter of Charles and Hannah Reeves. And she spent many hours with me. She was a Middletown woman, lived behind, those of you who know Route 35, there's a section there behind what used to be the old Two Guys, I still call it. Anyway, near that section of town. And she grew up and was actually born in that old house that I showed you. She was the last generation there. And she shared all these family stories with me. In fact, I dedicated the book to her because without her, I wouldn't have a book. And just an incredible amount of ancestry because, among other things, May had been a surgical nurse at Riverview Hospital in Red Bank for 40 years of her career. Her husband owned a business in Middletown. She had researched all of her family history that I've revealed some of to you now, because she had at one point been the president of the New Jersey chapter of the African American Genealogical and Historic Society. And what she revealed to me was not only her personal family stories, but things I never expected. I had always assumed as a white person that Black people didn't know their history, especially to slave times. It had all been disrupted by sales and moves and deaths, etc. And I'm wrong. Quite a number of Black families do know about their history, and May certainly did. And some of her relatives, including her son Edwin, are on the board with us to preserve the cemetery. So I've got a whole section in the book about that. It's just a really, really nice family story, I think. So winding up here, I know I'm a little bit over time. How did we approach abolition finally in New Jersey? Agonizingly slowly, okay, because of a lot of what we've talked about. Okay, you remember I mentioned that we had a series of laws to control and contain the Black population, and they were exceedingly harsh as time went on. One of the early ones seems like a kind of a cool law. It says, hey, if you want to free your slaves out of the goodness of your heart in 1714, you have to give us, the state, 200 pounds and 20 pounds every year after that enslaved person now free lives. Nobody has that kind of money in those days, certainly not the common slaveholders. And it's put into this act specifically to discourage manumitting slaves. And it goes on, and I'm giving you highlights. There were 30 or 40 really brutal laws. The 1804 Act of Gradual Abolition you already know about, but it gets worse before it ever got better. In our one of our early attempts at a constitution here, we say, just like the Declaration of Independence, all men are by nature free and independent. But the slaveholders that were still in New Jersey, the people who depended upon that institution, opposed it, took this section of the Constitution to court, and our Supreme Court in 1845 says, never mind, we only meant white men. We didn't mean women, we didn't mean Black people, we only meant white men. A couple years later, New Jersey decides we really have it right this time. We're serious, we're going to abolish slavery. But what we say is that if you're a current slave, you have to act as an apprentice to that slave master for the rest of your life. So it hardly matters what you call an enslaved person to them. Now, the good news is that because of the 1804 Act, by law, at the end of 21 or 25 years, slaveholders had to go back down to the courthouse and document that they manumitted these people. So more and more of these people are being freed over time. And we see that in the census records, the federal census records. And you see here that in New Jersey, the slave population starts to taper off really rapidly. However, Pennsylvania, they were a little bit ahead of us, folks, when it came to getting rid of slavery. In fact, on the eve of the Civil War, on paper, we have 18 slaves, but it's not really true because of this. There are people who are not designated slaves, but are still acting as slaves. They're apprentices. They don't appear. So who knows? There may be 100 or more slaves in New Jersey at the very edge of the beginning of the Civil War. So not a good record for us folks in New Jersey, but it is the history of where we are. So what happens? So in New Jersey, which was never a Confederate state, of course, but acted very sympathetically during the Civil War, mostly because of the industrial engagements that we had. in Paterson and Newark, you had factories that pre-Civil War were sending down goods to the southern plantation holders, including huge amounts of leather shoes for the slaves that were working on the plantations. So they had a vested interest in these New Jersey industrialists to keep slavery going. It was best for their economic interests. You might know that New Jersey was the only northern state that never gave its electoral college votes to Lincoln, either in the first election or his reelection. It has a lot to do with our history of enslavement. And here's a couple of charts that Graham Hodges did in one of his books. You can see that the percentage of slaves in New Jersey, I should say Monmouth County, is going down quite dramatically, okay? And then here, conversely, of course, the number of free Negroes, I meant New Jersey, but is going up. You know the story of the Civil War, right? South Carolina secedes soon after it begins. Lincoln gets inaugurated. Civil War starts. He issues the Emancipation Proclamation, but that only freed the slaves in the states of rebellion, which really didn't do it yet, of course, because the slaveholders down there are not going to pay attention to that. Lincoln could not free any of these slaves in the North by law because they were property. And the few that remained in the North were considered just that, private property. However, Lincoln, as you know, gets assassinated in April of 65. The war's over, and the 13th Amendment finally gets passed. And by December of 65, 28 states ratify that amendment. It is now the law of the land. Slavery is abolished forever. Oops. We're the very last northern state to go along with that ratification, precisely because the legislators in Trenton hemmed and hawed, being influenced by this 200-year legacy of slavery in our state. And they went along with it when it's a fait accompli. In January of 66, we finally agreed, okay, we'll do it. Now, it took another 150 years before our legislature officially issues an apology for what had happened here. And it's a nice thing, okay? It's a good beginning to express sympathy and regrets. But as we like to think, you know, you can't take regrets to the grocery store, because in that, there was one thing missing. There was no talk or no official anything about reparations. And as you well know, there is a lot of talk about reparations today. And I think it's something that will come. It's going to be involved in, I hope, having descendants of enslaved people be just that repaired, to gain reparations for what had happened, because it's pretty clear if you understand about redlining and all the things that causes so many problems in today's society, that Black people who are descendants of slaves, who have about 1/10 of the wealth of white people, have been harmed by what went on. The good news is that places like Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and also closer to home, the Princeton Theological Seminary have begun to grant scholarships to the proved descendants of the folks that they had once enslaved. And I think we're going to see, I know we're going to see a lot more talk about this as time goes on, as is only correct. There's a number of good books about it that you can read. I will just note that in this country, United States, we've had examples of reparations to, for instance, Native Americans that we've restored land and given money to for the wrongs done against them, and also to, more recently, the Japanese Americans who were interned during the World War II. So we've always somehow left out Black people, but I think that's going to change, and hopefully we'll see that. So you've been very polite, and I'll shut up now and allow you to either ask questions or have somebody read them to me, or whatever's appropriate. If you'd like a copy of the book, you can send me an email there, and I'll be glad to get one too. But with that said, thank you for being a great audience, and let's see who's got questions or, by the way, comments. I don't pretend to be an expert on slavery. I know some things, but I don't know everything. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that as well. So Lee, or thank you, Linda's clapping for me. Thank you, Lee, or Eric, or anyone else for that. But please, by all means, ask questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rick. That was a real great recounting with a real local emphasis here on Monmouth County. I presume your book covers other areas of New Jersey as well, but that you focused on our environs, because I mean, I was looking at some of those maps and I was like, oh yeah, I've you know, biked around that area and I've seen that graveyard and I've seen that, yeah. I'm,
as I mentioned at the outset,
familiar, very local places.
It startled me. You know, I knew none of this till, I don't know, 8 or 10 years ago. I mean, zero. And it's all being revealed now. And there's a lot of, and thank you for your group too. There's a lot of interest in this for very obvious reasons, I think, because as you can see, I believe that this black-white contrast that we have in this country, this social epidemic, literally, has long roots, and it's going to take a while for us to come to grips with this. But there are more and more people doing wonderful things to recognize this legacy.
Rick?
Yes.
Yeah. You mentioned early on that the harsh laws enacted, I guess it was back in the 17th century, played a big role, I'm paraphrasing what you said, in what's happening today. What exactly did you mean by that? Would you expand on that just briefly?
Yeah, sure, great. And it's a huge topic, but as I think everybody knows, okay, and depending upon how you were raised, okay, as a white, if you're a white person in this society, I mean, I was raised in, as you already know, Hudson County, and went to school in Jersey City. And until I got to Jersey City, I didn't have many black friends. I had one man, a young man who was an altar boy with me in church, but I lived in a white community, and I didn't know anything about black culture, and you know, for that matter, probably know not a whole lot now. But the result of slave laws, wherein black people were always less than, were treated with suspicion, were punished for, you know, minor crimes. You know, for instance, back in those days, and it lasted into the 19th century, you know, if you were an enslaved person who were caught off your master's property without a permission slip, a handwritten note from whoever owned you, you could be, in some laws, you could be beaten by any white person and returned to your slaveholder for a reward. And so this is fairly common. You were subject to punishment for learning, for having the audacity to try to learn how to read and write, or to have a book. And so when you treat a group of people, a large number of people, as different, as outside, as less than, that seeps through the generations. Okay, you know the famous phrase, you know, people are taught hate. People learn hate in their homes, as you learn love too. And if you're taught that black people are less than, you believe that, and that comes down. I mean, it's no mystery to me that when you see people, you know, brandishing the Confederate battle flag down south, these white supremacist people, they believe that stuff. They believe, no matter what they say, it's more about history, more than about history, of course. They believe in their culture that black people are less than. And we did too up here. And there are still people, you and I both know, all know people like this. And that's a result, in part, of the enslavement of these people and the laws that were enacted to treat them differently. I've got a list of, and you could find it online, just anybody here, just Google slave laws in New Jersey, and you'll be startled by the number of laws and how people are treated. You know, they could have their hands cut off if they were caught stealing. They could be blinded. In the early days of the late 17th century, early 18th, they were branding slaves on their forehead if they were caught doing things that were against the law. I mean, it's in Middletown on Kings Highway in the late 17th century, Black people who had killed another Lewis Morris, by the way, totally different Lewis Morris, they had killed him. They were hanged and beheaded on Kings Highway, right where the old First Baptist is today.
Yeah,
I mean, there were storms.
Yeah, Rick. So what you're saying in essence is there's a cultural and sociological
precisely
legacy for all of this. And I'm probably a little older than you, and I remember people saying these were Black. I was raised in Montclair, and about a third of that population, we there was never any prejudice that I saw, and that's the truth. Graduated in 61, so I think I am a little older than you. In any event, I remember Blacks saying to other Blacks in elementary school that someone was more Black, therefore they weren't as well regarded. I think the saying was, if you're brown, you can hang around. If you're Black, stay back. If you're white, you're okay. This was among Blacks, so they actually inculcated some of this themselves. Yeah, we see its legacy today, but there are those outliers like me, for example, and I did see some of this in my family. There was prejudice, and among younger people, some of my nephews. So it's not simple. It's not right across the board. But nevertheless, you're right. I agree with you. There's a great legacy.
You're exactly right. And to use a phrase, this is not black and white. There's a lot of gray, which I didn't talk about today. But you know that, you may not know this, there were enslaved Lenapes, and there were a lot of Lenapes who were free, who became slaveholders of Black people.
Sure.
And there is colorism within Black people today.
Absolutely.
They'll talk to you about it openly if you have friends.
And some of this was covert. Some of this was covert too. It wasn't overt. When I was growing up, people would talk, and it was polite to say colored people, not Negroes, but colored people. You remember that, I'm sure.
We've all gone through that. The most salient whitewashing that happened as I researched this book was the following. There was a book written about Hudson County in, I believe it was 1874, 1876. And it acknowledges in that book by a historian that there were enslaved people. In 1921, I came across a book that was written by I think it was the New Jersey Trust Company, a Jersey City bank, that I thought, this is going to have a lot about where this all began. There's not one mention in that 1921 book about slavery, Black people, the Dutch, home slaves, or anything.
To say nothing of lynching, among other things.
It was
We never learned that.
It was whitewash. Now, I'm on a committee, and those of you who live here in Monmouth County, you're going to see this if you haven't already. We are putting up a memorial to a man named Samuel Johnson, colloquially known as Mingo Jack, who was lynched in Eatontown in 1886. Hello, lynched in Eatontown in 1886.
20s, 30s.
Okay, and that's got to do with the Equal Justice Institute down in Brian Stevenson and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, to Joe's point, we have as a society, I'm not pointing fingers at anybody in particular, we have a society whitewash this memory. I would direct you to read the 1619 Project, among others, to find out how this has been suppressed. Now that, it's out in the open now. I'm sure that everyone on this call today is very well aware of this. Thank you, by the nature of who you all are. But I was raised in a family that had very little bias, but I noticed in my life that I have bias. And it shocks me when I notice it. And I think all of us, to a greater or lesser degree, have experienced that. So anyway, we're going off topic here a little. Other folks that might have questions or comments, I'd love to hear.
Yeah, I have a couple of just quick ones, I hope.
Sure.
Along Kings Highway, from Navesink over to Route 35, there's I believe a Black American cemetery back there somewhere. It's down a track. The track is dedicated to access. Do you know that? I mean, can you say anything about that?
Dedicated. I didn't hear the last word. Dedicated to what?
It's an African-American cemetery.
Right. And is it on Kings Highway itself?
Yeah, just off Kings Highway. Yes.
So I'm not sure which one you're talking about, but you know, and another, and I don't know about this particular cemetery is the real answer, but often in our history, not New Jersey, but everywhere as well, Black people, even when they were free or just had been born free, were not allowed to be buried in cemeteries with white people. I don't know the history of the one you're in particular talking about, frankly, but it wouldn't surprise me if it was dedicated or probably owned by Black folks. It's very common. There's a number of cemeteries in North Jersey that I'm familiar with, including one up in Milford in Bergen County, where a school was built over. You know, there are homes in New Jersey that have been built on what were formerly Black enslaved cemeteries. You know, it's one of those things. But in Monmouth County in particular, as you already know from what we talked about briefly today, there's a lot of African American heritage. I'm happy to tell you that I'm working not only with the folks at Lincroft, but also Mayor Perry of Middletown, who is we've designed a plaque for that cemetery, but some other places around Monmouth County are going to erect memorial plaques, if you will, to positive African American history, things that happened here that were instrumental to the fabric of our society, but unrecognized. I'll give you an example. When I talked about Colonel Ty, I've got one friend in particular said to me, "Hey, you talk about him like he was a hero. We always think of him as a terrorist." And I said, "One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter." I mean, you know, Colonel Ty, in my view, did something pretty good. Who among us wouldn't fight for their freedom?
The other thing I just wanted to ask, I understand that there's a certain amount of intermarriage between the indigenous peoples and the escaped slaves and escaped enslaved people. Did that happen in New Jersey as well as, you know, elsewhere in the U.S.?
Well, as a matter of fact, it did. I've got a good friend who lives in Lincroft who's descended from African Americans, Cherokee, and Lenapes. And there's a whole lot of story to that. But if any of you who live in Monmouth County know Shafto Road here, okay, that was owned, part of it was called Reevey Town. The Reeveys and the Reeves, different families, we can't quite link them up yet, have a very mixed background, but it makes sense when you think about it. Marginalized people are always put out in the fringes, and Shafto Road, way back when, part of Tinton Falls, as a matter of fact, was where enslaved and then manumitted Black people were literally pushed to live, as were the descendants of Lenapes and Cherokees that came up from Georgia. And of course, they would intermarry all the time. And there's a long, long history of that very directly in Monmouth County, as there is throughout the colonial America. And it's, depending on how you look at it, disgraceful or a testament to people's ability to rise above their circumstances. You all know, I'm sure, about Thomas Jefferson living in Paris openly with Sally Hemings, who, when they came back, was his slave. And they had children. There's a fascinating group of those stories. But we have those stories here in Red Bank and in Monmouth County. What I didn't mention today, well now, is that Charles Reeve worshipped at what was the original Pilgrim Baptist, now on Shrewsbury Avenue, but is now that little Russian Orthodox church on that corner there that you make when you come across the bridge from Middletown. That was the original Pilgrim Baptist. Reeves, on the cover of the book here, was one of the early members of that church. But again, yes, there's all colors involved here. Black, white, gray, red, yellow, whatever designations we disgracefully use to depict people of so-called different races. And people are people. Now, what we have to admit, and it didn't happen just south, is white men creating a bigger group of their own slaves by inseminating their black women slaves. Another name for that is rape. And that's what was going on. And it happened here and it happened everywhere. I don't know that Lewis Morris participated, but I'll bet the white workmen on his fireworks did. And, you know, aside from it's the horrific behavior of it, it is also part of human nature. People do these things. And that led to the discussion we had before about the different colorations of African Americans today. Anyway, but thank you, Colin. Those are really good observations.
Thank you.
Anybody else want to comment?
Yeah,
or question?
I actually attended a talk by a descendant, by a lady, and apparently, I forget her name, but apparently there's an organization that is a group of people who are of mixed heritage between Lenapis and it's a group right here in Monmouth County. I forget their name, but I heard her talk about it. Quite a few, and they're quite active.
She's a friend of mine that I referred to. Her name is Claire Garland.
That's
Garland.
That's it. Yeah.
She has. You can look at it up online. A group called the Sand Hill Indians.
That's right.
That's a section in Neptune. In Neptune. And she's the person with the very, very mixed heritage and a fascinating.
Very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. She's spoken quite a lot. She's wonderful. Former school teacher.
And I have another question for you, Rick. To which groups and organizations, institutions around here have you spoken to, be they civic or civil or educational or religious or libraries? I know you spoke in the Red Bank one, but which group have you spoken to, and have there been, as far as you know, seriously conservative groups who have also asked you to speak?
So no to the last part of that question, as you would expect. But I've been happy and privileged, and you know, February just passed. Of course, it's always a busy month for me. I've spoken at a lot of historic societies, a lot of libraries, including the Red Bank Library, who does a great job with Let's Talk About Race. You may know that series of discussions. I've spoken at Pilgrim Baptist. I spoke at St. Thomas in Red Bank just a couple of weeks ago. And these are largely Black congregations. And I will tell you, they're wonderful because, as I mentioned before, they know a lot of this history. Primarily, like tonight, and just looking, which is always a dangerous thing, at people's faces, to a primarily white audience. I'm happy to tell you that, and I don't ask people's politics, I have no idea what librarian audiences are, or what library audiences or historic societies, but at least they appear white. But in general, they've been very, very receptive of these stories. I will tell you that I often learn a lot because people like all of you have done today remind me of things or tell me things I don't know. And I think there's a I actually do sense it. There's a craving for this information because, like all of you, I hope, unless we can deal with this, we're not going to be able to go toward an equitable and just society, which I certainly want. I bet you all do too. There's a wonderful new movie that I would recommend that was debuted a couple of weeks ago at the Count Basie Theater. Great name for a theater about this, right? Called Who We Are.
Mm-hmm.
But look it up. It was, I don't know if anybody here was on that or went to that premiere. It was stunning because it talks about the effects of slavery throughout our country and our history. When I heard Walter Grayson put together a call with Nicole Hannah-Jones this week that I was on. Mm-hmm. And her contention, backed up by her scholarship and the wonderful 1619 project, is that unless we can get past this whitewashing, literally, of our history, we can't move forward. And look what's happening. look what happened with Black Lives Matter after George Floyd was murdered. Look at the revulsion and the ugliness that came out of that. Because people don't want to acknowledge this, and I'll be more candid. Like me, we don't know it. We don't know this history. You know, people have said to me, and I'm sure to all of you, "Oh no, there was never slavery in New Jersey. They were all indentured servants." It's not true. But we all look, I'm no different than anybody else. We all hold on to our core beliefs. What your family, that, you know, if you were lucky to be raised in a good family, what they told you is what you believe. What your church told you, you believe. What you don't know can hurt you. We don't know what we don't know.
Rick, I have another question now that you talk about that. You mentioned, and you showed it on the slide, that the apology of 2008 that New Jersey did included specifically to teach children about our history. Is there any way you could or would or have done research of all the other 49 histories, any amendments to their constitution of the other 49 states? Or is New Jersey one of maybe 3 or 4 only who have that?
If you can guarantee that I can live that long, I'll certainly research. But I think, in fact, Joe was kind, but Joe, I'm not that much younger than you.
I knew you were a little younger, though.
A little bit. But anyway,
I guess.
Yeah, there's a movement toward that. Now, by the way, as a result of that New Jersey proclamation, we established in our Department of Education something called the Amistad Commission. You'll recognize the name.
Yeah.
And that commission, go out online and look at it. They've created wonderful curricula for, by law, mandated instruction about African American history in the States. The problem is, and I've spoken at a number of grammar schools and high schools, the problem is, I'm going to use the word many, not a lot, but many teachers are ill-equipped. They weren't, like me, I taught high school. I wasn't equipped to teach this. I didn't know about it. And so what happens in February, teachers do a module of, African American history because they're uncomfortable in some cases with it. Then they go on. Now, the head of that commission has said, and she's wonderful, has said many times, we need to infuse African American history into our history. It's not just a block that happened, around the Civil War. It's all part of it. Anyone can make, before me, anybody can make a case that without Black African Americans, this country is today.
But Rick, to push back on that, there's a great deal of pushback in many states now. In many states in education. I also taught and read about it all the time. And this is scary. I did not teach history, but that was my minor. But in any event, if anyone isn't, I'm paraphrasing, these things. If anyone is made uncomfortable, and they're talking mainly in the South, if anyone is made uncomfortable, those things are not to be taught. And they're aiming that specifically at Black history.
Well, anybody here want
specifically at the 1619 Project, that. There's a 1776 project. So all of this is a tremendous pushback from people on the right and people in the middle who, as you say, I call them willfully ignorant. It's not that they don't know, because I know people who know, but they'll say to you that, oh no, and I've heard this from politicians in Morris County, that the slaves were better off as slaves in America than as people living in Africa. That is a quote just about from one politician who's still in office.
It goes beyond
scary stuff.
It goes beyond that quote today. That goes back way back. That goes back to the 19th century during the repatriation movement.
Well, my point is it's in existence now, Rick. How do you address it? You're saying that people are changing the curricula. On the other hand, there's so much pushback.
Here's how I address it.
Okay.
I'm not going to move to Texas. Okay. And those
not
states.
Just Texas either.
Okay. Because you're exactly right. Okay. This false mantra that kids are being taught critical race theory. It's baloney.
They'll call it.
It's baloney. Nobody's being taught that. And by the way, as all of us who are adults here know, yes, one of the problems with being a child is sometimes you become uncomfortable. You become uncomfortable when you slice your knee open on the playground, but nobody is banning playgrounds.
And you learn from it, and you learn from that uncomfort.
Right. Now, what am I going to do about it? There's nothing I can do about it except what we're all doing today. We can talk about it. We can vote. We can thank God that we're living in New Jersey, which is a little bit more, progressive than a lot of places. But there will always be pushback. But it seems to me, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, maybe. But I can just tell you, anecdotally, that people like you are dying to hear this information, and that has a positive effect. There are, and to get back to schools, there are school teachers who are investing time in learning this so they can teach it in New Jersey. I can't worry about Texas, other than not wanting to go there anymore. They have a board of education that's for the whole state. They've controlled the state textbook for years, and now they're disgraceful. And you could quote me, politicians are doing horrible things, not only theirs, but to the LGBT community.
I wasn't, by the way, I wasn't aiming it at particularly you.
I understand.
You should do, what we all should do. On the other hand, it's not simply, and I don't want to monopolize this, but it's not simply Texas. There are many, many states, Missouri, Kansas, and so on, who have enacted these laws. And we could get into all of that another time. But it's scary stuff. And many teachers are leaving, from what I've read. And I know a few, because they're afraid that they cannot open their mouths and say things which might make folks uncomfortable. And we all agree on this. You need to make people uncomfortable to learn sometimes. Anyway.
I couldn't agree with you. I couldn't agree with you more. So we have to be diligent, right? What can we do? Yep. Who else? You've been a really great group to stay on all this time. Anybody else? And I could do this all day, but you certainly don't want me to. Any other questions or comments? So let me go ahead, Beata.
Oh, Beata, you're muted.
Muted.
Thank you. What makes you so sure, Rick, that we will that we're heading toward eventually or soon to make reparations? I think that was much more in the news 2-3 years ago with the Tahiti's book. Is it going to happen? I don't see it moving in that direction at all.
So I can't predict anything, obviously. But there's an I'm going to use this word. There's an undercurrent of concern and people working, including myself and probably some of you, toward that. And all I can do is this. I can talk about it. By the way, there's a great book about reparations that I recommend by the Dohertys. You can look up William Doherty, and I forget the name of the book because it's not at top of mind right now. It's all about the case for reparations. There are many, many, many people talking about it. Don't look at the newspapers or the 12 minutes of news you get at night at 6:30 to find out about reparations laws. There's a groundswell, I've heard, of people, black, white, and everything else, who are working toward this. I think it will happen. Do I see it in my lifetime? I don't know. And will there be pushback? Absolutely. The common thing is, you all know this, right? Hey, I didn't enslave anybody. Why would I want my tax dollars to go toward this? And if you read the Doherty's book about equality, okay, you can see why, in order to heal some of the ills of our society, we need reparations to these people that have been harmed. And again, I'll leave it to deeper scholars than myself to talk about that. And maybe I'm more hopeful than I should be, but I have to be hopeful. Otherwise I collapse into despair, and I don't want to do that.
Thank you.
Eric, what do you think?
Yeah, no, this is very good. I really appreciate you going and exhausting our questions, and it's a really good talk. And I appreciate the the way you gave it the local emphasis here. I know you live in Monmouth County as well, so you've had plenty of material. But thanks for customizing it for us, and we really appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate everybody, and just again to follow up, you know, we're individual voices, but that has impact. When you think about individual voices, we can talk to our loved ones, our friends, and you know, in whatever forums, you know, social or political or business about stuff. You know, I think it's past time. It's an embarrassing conversation sometimes, but I think we have to talk about these things. And you know, I appreciate this group for what I understand about what you do in general, and I appreciate a lot that you were able to listen to this morning. And by the way, my email is there not just for you to buy a book from me, but if you have a question or a concern or a comment or want to lead me to something I don't know, I'm more than welcome. So thanks again to everybody this morning. And spring is almost here, so don't give up yet.
Yeah, we'll keep in touch.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Thank you
Enjoy
very
the
much.
day.
Thanks a lot,
Thank
Rick.
you.
Great talk.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.